For 18 months, transportation policy analysts have tracked signals emerging from Brussels, signals that suggested the EU was preparing to overhaul how member nations handle driver licensing for citizens over 70. The traditional approach across much of Europe had been simple but blunt. Once you reached a certain age, your license expired more frequently. Renewals became shorter. Bureaucratic hurdles multiplied. And for millions of seniors from Portugal to Poland, the message was clear. Your age, not your ability, determined your right to drive. But that changed in early 2026 when a new EU directive rolled out across the continent. A directive that eliminated automatic license expiration at age 70. A directive that replaced rigid age-based cutoffs with something far more nuanced, something American policymakers are now being urged to consider. Under the new European framework, once drivers turn 70, they can secure what officials are calling lifetime license renewal, not automatically, not without conditions, but through a system that prioritizes health assessments and ability evaluations over arbitrary birthday milestones. Seniors from Lisbon to Lyon have celebrated the change as recognition of something many felt their governments had ignored for too long, that aging bodies vary widely, that a 75-year-old marathon runner may have sharper reflexes than a sedentary 50-year-old. That dignity demands individualized assessment, not blanket discrimination. For Europeans like Andre, a 72-year-old retired engineer in rural Portugal, and Carmen, a 74-year-old grandmother in southern Spain, the car is not a luxury. It is a lifeline. It connects them to groceries, healthcare appointments, family gatherings, and community life that would otherwise become inaccessible. The EU directive does not eliminate safety checks. It reframes them. Assess ability, not just birthdays. Evaluate fitness, not just age. Trust individuals to demonstrate competence rather than assuming decline. The implementation varies by country. In Portugal, older drivers now synchronize their license reviews with routine doctor visits instead of battling long queues at licensing offices every few years. In Spain and France, simplified medical reviews replace blanket retesting to reduce bureaucratic friction without ignoring safety. Vision tests remain mandatory. Cognitive screenings can be required where appropriate. Driving assessments continue for those whose medical profiles raise concerns. But the fundamental philosophy has shifted. The question is no longer whether you have passed a certain age. The question is whether you can still drive safely, and here is where the story becomes critical for every American watching tonight. Because transportation officials in Washington are paying very close attention to how this European experiment unfolds. They are tracking safety statistics. They are monitoring implementation challenges. They are calculating what similar policies might mean for the 50 million Americans currently over age 65. Americans who represent a growing share of the motoring public. Americans whose votes, whose advocacy, and whose daily dependence on vehicles make this one of the most politically sensitive transportation debates of the decade. The current American system for handling senior driver licensing is nothing like what Europe just implemented. It is fragmented. It is inconsistent. It is a patchwork of state-level regulations that vary so dramatically from one jurisdiction to another that a 75-year-old driver in Arizona faces entirely different requirements than a 75-year-old driver in Illinois. There is no federal rule mandating vision exams at specific ages. There is no nationwide standard requiring cognitive testing for older drivers. There is no unified protocol for road tests, medical reporting, or family-initiated reviews. States set their own renewal intervals. States determine their own testing requirements. States decide whether seniors can renew online, by mail, or must appear in person. And the result is a system that experts describe as simultaneously too lenient in some jurisdictions and too punitive in others. Consider the range of approaches currently in effect across American states. Many states require drivers over 70 to renew their licenses in person and complete a standard vision test. That sounds reasonable. But the standards for what constitutes passing that vision test vary considerably. Illinois has gone further at times by mandating actual road tests for drivers once they reach certain ages, although recent legislation has scaled back how frequently those tests are required following pushback from senior advocacy groups. In other states, seniors can renew entirely by mail or online until they reach age 75 or 80. at which point more frequent checks become mandatory. The inconsistency creates confusion, it creates inequity, and it creates situations where a driver who is perfectly safe to operate a vehicle in one state might face license suspension simply by moving to a state with stricter age-based requirements. That is not a system designed around safety. That is a system designed around administrative convenience and political compromise. Now here is what makes this moment so important for American drivers to understand. Contrary to rumors that have circulated online suggesting that federal regulations will soon require annual testing for drivers over 87 or mandatory cognitive exams starting at 75, those specific claims have been debunked. There is no August 2025 federal rule implementing nationwide senior testing requirements. There is no imminent mandate standardizing cognitive evaluations across all 50 states. But the absence of immediate federal action does not mean the debate is settled. It means the debate is ongoing. It means policymakers are watching Europe. It means advocacy groups on both sides are mobilizing. It means the rules that govern your right to drive as you age could change significantly, depending on which philosophy ultimately prevails. The European model offers one vision, a vision built around lifetime licensing tied to health assessments. A vision that eliminates the stigma of automatic expiration while maintaining safety through individualized evaluation. Supporters argue this approach respects dignity, reduces unnecessary bureaucracy, and acknowledges that calendar age is a poor proxy for driving ability. Critics raise legitimate concerns. Health conditions can develop rapidly between scheduled reviews. Cognitive decline may not be apparent during brief medical appointments, and the system still relies on seniors to self-report concerns honestly, something that decades of research suggests many are reluctant to do when their independence is at stake. The American model, such as it is, offers a different vision, a vision built around state autonomy and local flexibility. Supporters argue this allows jurisdictions to tailor requirements to their specific demographics and transportation realities. Rural states where driving is essential for survival can calibrate differently than urban states with robust public transit alternatives. But critics of the American approach point to the obvious problem. Safety should not depend on which state you happen to live in. A driver experiencing cognitive decline is equally dangerous whether they are navigating highways in Florida or Montana. And without mandatory periodic health assessments at the federal level, some medical conditions that impair driving ability go entirely undetected until they result in tragedy. Transportation safety researchers have published extensive data on this question. Drivers over 70 are statistically more likely to be involved in fatal crashes per mile driven than middle-aged drivers, but they also drive fewer miles overall, which complicates the raw statistics. And importantly, the variation within age groups is enormous. Some 80-year-olds demonstrate reaction times and cognitive function equivalent to drivers decades younger. Others show significant decline by their mid-60s. That variation is precisely why the EU's ability-based approach has gained traction among policy experts. It acknowledges biological reality rather than relying on arbitrary age cutoffs. But it also requires infrastructure that the United States currently lacks. It requires coordination between medical providers and licensing authorities. It requires standardized assessment protocols. It requires training for the healthcare professionals conducting evaluations. And it requires political will to implement changes that some constituencies will inevitably resist. Here is what we know about where this debate is heading. Senior advocacy organizations in the United States are closely monitoring the European implementation. They are preparing policy recommendations that could be introduced at both state and federal levels. Insurance industry analysts are calculating how different licensing frameworks affect risk pools and premium structures, and transportation safety officials are updating their models to account for the rapidly aging American driving population. The conversation is not about whether older Americans should be allowed to drive. The conversation is about how society balances safety with autonomy, how we protect vulnerable road users without stripping independence from capable seniors, how we design systems that are fair, consistent, and grounded in medical reality rather than political convenience. What happens next will depend on choices made in state capitals and in Washington. It will depend on whether policymakers prioritize uniformity or flexibility. It will depend on whether safety advocates and senior rights groups can find common ground. and it will depend on whether the European experiment succeeds or reveals unforeseen complications. For the 50 million Americans currently over 65 and the millions more approaching that threshold, these are not abstract policy debates. These are questions that will determine whether driving remains a right they can exercise or becomes a privilege that requires periodic justification. Questions that will determine whether their independence is protected or gradually eroded by bureaucratic requirements. Questions that will shape their daily lives in ways that younger Americans may not fully appreciate until they face those same crossroads themselves. Tonight, the European Union has offered one answer to these questions, an answer built on trust, individualized assessment, and the belief that aging should not automatically equal disqualification. Whether America embraces that answer, rejects it, or charts some middle path remains to be seen. But what is certain is that this debate is far from over. The signals emerging from Washington suggest that policymakers recognize the status quo is increasingly untenable. The American population is aging faster than our transportation policies have adapted, and the pressure to act, whether through federal standards or coordinated state reforms, will only intensify in the years ahead. We will continue monitoring these developments closely. We will report on every significant policy proposal, every legislative hearing, every regulatory shift that affects your right to drive as you age. Because this is not merely a transportation issue. This is an issue of independence. This is an issue of dignity. This is an issue that will touch every American family eventually. The question is not whether change is coming. The question is what form that change will take, and whether you will be prepared when it arrives. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay with us as this story continues to unfold.